Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming to. I forgot to say that there's a free lunch, so very happy that you're here. We're resuming. Those of you who were not here last week, there was a meeting at 2 p.m., but most of the meetings this week, which is a resumption of what we did last semester. Last semester we had regular meetings at 5:30, and this time they'll be normally at noon, apart from one other meeting that will be at 2 p.m. I don't know how many of you were coming last semester, but this semester we now have all lined up. So this is our second talk, and I'm very glad that you're here. As you recall, we are trying to understand what is going on and the context of events since October 7th, but we're trying to think about it in a larger context and to think about things analytically, not dispassionately, but on a scholarly level. And I think last semester we learned a great deal, and I hope that the same will happen today, and I'm very glad that we have our distinguished speaker here, and Elias will now introduce him. Elias Muhanna, by the way, is among other things, from the history department at Colleague.
Hi, everybody. Elias Muhanna. I'm an associate professor here at Brown in history and comparative literature, and I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Arnon Degani, who is a fellow at the Harman Center at the Hebrew University and a senior researcher at Molad. His research focuses on the Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel, the Oslo Accords, and whether and how the settler colonialism framework benefits the study of Zionism. This spring semester, he's teaching a course, which is an introduction to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at Lehigh University. Welcome, Arnon.
Thanks so much. Well, let's begin. More than a decade ago, I began writing my doctoral dissertation on the Israeli military government over the Palestinian citizens of Israel. When I mentioned this in small talk, 90% of Israelis younger than 50 and almost all Americans who care about Israel-Palestine replied with a "huh? What do you mean military government? You mean the occupation?" And I'd said, no, the military government over the Arabs in Israel. You know, those with the blue identity card. They were also, until December 1966, under military rule. Then I'd get another, interesting. And I can't blame the gaps in knowledge here. I discovered this fact only in my first year at Ben-Gurion University, and I had to take an Israeli history class to figure that out. I had no idea. And I started this whole academia thing because of my personal experiences as an infantry soldier in the West Bank at the height of the Second Intifada. What I did most of the time, more or less what you see here on the picture to the right, was implement arbitrary movement restrictions on Palestinians, which I can tell you, this is a lot of what the military government over the Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel was about, movement restrictions. And I went to school, to university, to understand how we as a society, Israeli society, started to behave like this. And I realized that this was like this from the inception. And I wanted to study that. And this realization that ever since it was created, Israel has enacted some sort of military rule over Palestinian civilians. It seemed to fit very well with how Zionism was conceptualized in much of the academic writing I was exposed to in the early 2000s. Zionism, in most scholarship, is animated as an ethno-national ideology with an unchanging core that pushes its adherents towards the creation and maintenance of a Jewish state like the one that was created in 1948. What does the Jewish in the Jewish state mean? It means that it's a state that will perpetually subordinate its non-Jewish subjects or Palestinians. And this is the Israel, frankly, that I grew up in the 80s and 90s. According to this conceptualization, any withdrawal from the territory of the state or moderation in the level of oppression applied to Palestinian Arabs, it required a disinvestment from Zionism, a dilution of Zionism with pragmatism or humanism or liberalism, or it requires an abandoning of Zionism, becoming post-Zionist. Within this framework, I noticed that an important article of faith among leftist Zionists or liberal Zionists became very unpopular, kind of like liberal or leftist Zionists. That article of faith is that the year 1967 mattered. And this is where right-wing Zionists and anti-Zionists seem to completely agree. According to these opposite camps, the post-1967 settlement movement in the occupied territories is a direct and seamless continuation of a core of a Zionist logic. Now, if Zionism has an essence, and if that essence can be summed up with a concept, that could save space on picket signs, it could help us get to the point faster when we're writing our articles, it could substitute the need to provide rigorous historical explanations for why Zionists did the things they did, and in this case, what kind of was in the air and was latched onto, it was colonialism, the obvious candidate. There is a long tradition of associating Zionism with colonialism that, of course, predates 1948. Zionism never fit well with this concept because, we all know, Zionists came to Palestine to claim it for, not to claim it for an empire. On the other hand, the dependency that the Zionist movement had on the most colonial of all empires, the British, between 1917 and 1947 is well known. Israel's self-image as a bastion of the West fits well with the idea that it is a colony of the United States. But we all know that Israel never fit perfectly in the colonial model. It is, after all, a sovereign state that was created through a post-colonial maneuver, or like detachment from the British Empire. Yet by the time I started working on my dissertation in the early 2010s, the term settler colonialism began to take traction in academia as a way to resolve the gaps in applying colonialism to Zionism. You could see this happening in adaptations of dissertations to books, where the word settler colonialism in the dissertation form appeared as settler colonialism in the published book. As a way to, settler colonialism replaced colonialism as a way to explain Zionist deed and thoughts. 2005, an edited volume by Pedersen and Elkins about settler colonialism in the 20th century features 2 chapters about Zionism. 2006, Lorenzo Veracini came out with Israel and Settler Society. 2008, Gabby Peterberg, who used to be my advisor at UCLA, came out with The Returns of Zionism. In 2012, an edited volume of Settler Colonial Studies focusing on Palestine. In 2013, Shira Robinson's book on the topic that really shaped the field, on the topic that I was researching, also alluded to Zionism as being settler colonial in the very title of the book, The Liberal Settler State. And so I, too, decided that the best way to explain the persistence of Israeli military regimes over civilian Palestinian Arab population was settler colonialism. That's the key. Okay, so put a pin on this story of my relationship with Zionism and settler colonialism and the military government, and we'll return to it shortly, and I'm sure you can't wait. Anyways, since the 2010s and from then on, the term seemed to replace colonialism as the ultimate shortcut to explain Zionism. In syllabi, Palestinian activist solidarity speak, Initially, you have that on campuses, and then it's everywhere. I think Rashid Khalidi's 2020 book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917-2017, sealed the deal for the academic world. Zionism is settler colonialism. What is this settler colonialism that Zionism is indicted with? Well, that's not entirely clear. Obviously, it's a worldview that pits Jews against Palestinians. There's some dehumanization there, a sense of superiority or supremacy, a need to separate, a need to segregate from Arabs. You find it there, but at times you find genocidal thoughts and fantasies of displacement. This worldview is implicated in the drive to settle land in Eretz Israel. Israel has settlers right now. It is building settlements. It also conquered territory. It controls population without incorporating it into its citizenry. That seems to be colonialism. So if there's colonialism and there's settlers, and so we take these two together, oh, settler colonialism. A colonialism that has settlers. This conception of settler colonialism as a type of colonialism colored some of the reactions to 10/7. The Gaza Strip and its environs were immediately cast as the shores of Algiers. The Israeli in the kibbutzim and towns were the Pied Noir, and Hamas were the FLN. The Harvard student letter from October 9th, which colored so much of the perceptions on what is going on throughout college campuses, mentioned that the coming days will require a firm stand against colonial retaliation. So what's going on here? Quite ironically, the Team Israel folks who reject any comparison between Israel and other settler colonial cases share Team Palestine's misunderstanding of this concept. Both sides understand that colonialism is bad and that its dissipation from the globe was just. The stakes are, therefore, that if Zionism is settler colonialism, and settler colonialism is indeed a type of colonialism, then Israel should go the way of past colonial endeavors. It should no longer exist. Now, of course, you are free to think about settler colonialism in this way. As far as I'm concerned, you are free to think about Israel in this way. But I want to argue that this understanding or misunderstanding of what settler colonialism is not only inflames campus rhetoric, okay? The story's not about us, right? But hampers our ability to conduct rigorous scholarship on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And tragically, this conceptual mess, I think, hampers our ability to imagine an end to this conflict that does not involve the total defeat of either side. Okay, so if everybody has settler colonialism so wrong, what's the right way to look at settler colonialism? First of all, colonialism and settler colonialism should be, not as a derivative of one another, should be understood as two ideal types on opposite sides of a spectrum that's vectors of capitalist expansion. I think that is the most succinct way that I can define it. And since this is a spectrum, Zionism and Zionists are somewhere in between. And since Zionism should conform to the standards of the historical discipline, we should recognize that it can move on the spectrum, depending on time, place, and subject to contingent factors. And when I say Zionism is settler colonialism, I'm really saying that Zionism is closer to the settler colonial end of the spectrum than the colonial one. But that's too long, so I say it's settler colonialism. But this is what I mean. So as an ideal type, we know that colonialism involves missionaries or soldiers or administrators, business people, and sometimes even settlers who serve the purpose of expanding imperial sovereignty to other countries. See France and Algeria, and Britain and Kenya. On the other hand, settler colonists may originate as emissaries of an empire, but what distinguishes them is their detachment from the place they left and their mission, they wish to reconstitute as something new. See, a new flag, right? As something new in the place they arrive at. They develop unique sovereign claims, separate from an imperial center, and in tension with whomever they encounter when they reach that place. The ubiquitous claim that Zionism never had an imperial metropole, right, is indeed distances Zionism from the colonial model. But it suggests that it is very much compatible with settler colonialism, as theorized here, right? If you're about, if you find value in settler colonialism, the fact that there's no concrete metropole, that is actually conducive. It actually places it closer to the ideal type. So, another key difference between colonial and settler colonial movements lies in the relationship that the settlers form with the people they encounter. They're not immigrants. They don't wish to assimilate with whoever is there and their society. But they also tend to avoid mastering them, with exceptions. The late Australian scholar Patrick Wolfe summarized the difference between colonial and settler colonial relationships in a crude but succinct way. Whereas colonialism is premised on exploitation and control of indigenous peoples, settler colonialism is premised on indigenous erasure or elimination. Colonists exploited natives to extract natural and human resources and direct them toward the metropole. Classic example would be British rule in India, where Indians' labor and consumption enriched the East Indian Company and then the British Treasury. Exploitation required violent subjugation, but colonial powers had no interest in bringing the natives to the brink of annihilation. Why? Because if there's no one to exploit, what use is there for a colonial empire? In contrast, settler colonists wished to replace the native population, to become the native population, and often inflicted violence upon them in ways that drastically reduced their numbers and landholding. Wolfe's logic of native elimination or erasure, at the heart of settler projects, explains acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing that occurred in many settler colonial cases, the United States being a prominent example. Here's the kicker. Native erasure also manifested in ways that Wolfe broadly placed under the category of assimilation. The political, cultural, and even biological absorption of the native population into the settler body politique. Indigenous assimilation is an effective means for settler colonial consolidation, for it attenuates the natives' resistance to the settler project. And when settlers and indigenous see each other as compatriots, the latter, the natives, essentially forfeit their claim to exclusive indigeneity. The assimilation that occurs in settler colonial cases would undermine the core logic of a colonial empire. It's a regime. Colonialism is based on difference and hierarchy, one above the other. You can't have that with assimilation. As the Woody Guthrie song goes, this land is your land, this land is my land, this land was made for you and me. That's the logic. Equipped with these insights, let's see how settler colonialism helps explain chapters of Zionist history. Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who no one can suspect is a member of Students for Justice in Palestine, is an early adopter of the settler colonial prism to predict that the Palestinian Arabs will not welcome the Zionist project in Palestine. He understood in his seminal The Iron Wall that exceptionalities of Zionism, and there are a lot of exceptionalities. I think that there is no case in which settlers arrive to a country where they encounter in the country people that have such an organic connection to them already amongst the indigenous population. That's the Jewish community, which was less than 10% of the population, and yet was a part of Palestinian pre-Zionist society. He understood that all the differences, everything that makes Zionism unique, and there's a lot of stuff, it doesn't matter. Because when European Jews decided that the solution to their problem was elsewhere on the globe, they also faced the same fundamental problem all other settler colonial projects face. And that is, the land they coveted was not empty. That's it. And so, like all settlers, Zionists developed visions that would diminish the native problem. There was a native problem as soon as Zionism is created. An aspiration for Jewish demographic superiority, whether through willful Palestinian Arab emigration or by force, accompanied Zionism through the ages and exists today. We know that. But a settler colonial analysis can also explain a forgotten Zionist integrationist drive and a preponderance to envision inclusive democratic regimes. A one democratic state, if you will. In his essential 2018 book, Beyond the Nation State, Dmitry Shumsky demonstrated that until the late 1920s, the Zionist mainstream formulated a succession of binational and federative arrangements, such as Jewish autonomy under the Ottoman Empire, a binational state, a Jewish state federated with a larger Arab state, and a Jewish state part of the British Commonwealth. All of these paths would have spelled the erasure of a distinct and hostile indigenous entity by guaranteeing political equality between Palestinian Arabs and Jews. So, under Zionism as settler colonialism, and settler colonialism as a type of colonialism, under that kind of thinking, we have to ignore these one-state Zionist visions. We have to describe them as marginal, deceptive, conspiratorial, ingenuine. The settler colonial definition I offer allows us to explain them as authentic, structural, and congruent with the historical circumstances of Zionism, early Zionism. The reason Zionist settlers lean towards integrative or inclusive visions, it's not Jewish liberalism, it's not the love of Palestinians. History. Compared to other settler colonial cases, the indigenous population that the Zionists encountered was relatively strong. Okay, the balance of power was very much in the favor of the natives compared to other cases. So until 1917, with the Balfour Declaration, when the British adopted Zionism, Zionists could not even imagine militarily defeating the Palestinians. So they had to support political frameworks that could potentially appeal to the Palestinian Arabs, right? If 1948-like vision was the dominant one, then the Palestinians would have, then who could have complained that the Palestinians are not willing to compromise? Binationalism, while it's more palatable than ethnic cleansing, right? You'd agree with me. It nevertheless can be ascribed to a drive, in Wolf's words, of indigenous elimination. Binationalism, indigenous elimination. that's present in all settler societies. And though it's very hard to imagine this in 2024, Jewish-Arab equality was part of a Zionist political logic no less than fantasies of Jewish ethno-homogeneity. The Israel Project. Okay, let's return to me and the military government over the Palestinian Arab citizens. Israel's 1948 birth through the formal detachment from the British Empire. Settlers detach from whoever kind of they are that sponsors them from the outside, and displacement of whoever was there of more than 700,000 Palestinians. That's a quintessential settler colonial moment, the Nakba. We can all understand that. Once Zionists created Israel as an almost mono-ethnic Jewish state, binationalism disappeared completely as a Zionist agenda. But there were still Palestinian Arabs within the Jewish state. Now, if you're me, 10 years ago, you're entirely under the sway of this conceptualization of Zionism as essential ethno-national movement, and you're thinking about settler colonialism as a type of colonialism, so it would seem to make sense to place the Palestinians under martial law that essentially nullified citizenship that they just reluctantly received from the state. But then I delved into this martial law, and I could not ignore the simple fact that citizenship, even with the military government, provided a discursive, legal, and political infrastructure for Arabs and Zionist Jews to strive for more civic equality. Palestinian Arab citizens recognized the Zionist state and conducted a non-violent and political struggle to improve their lot. With time, prominent Zionists turned on the military government, claiming that it was unnecessary and then even harmful to the desired integration of the Arab citizens. I did this animation of the military government dissipating. I'm very proud of it. So, from the mid-1950s, Israeli governments gradually eased the military government's restrictions and then canceled it altogether in December of '66. The integration of Palestinian Arabs into Israeli society consistently left them in a subordinate status and as a suspect population. But my come-to-Jesus moment was when Lorenzo Veracini sat down with me at a bar next to UCLA and told me, the military government is not what is settler colonialism about early Israel. Its dismantling is what's congruent with settler colonialism. The protracted and partial integration of Palestinian Arabs into Israeli society, the improvement in services, the improvement in health statistics, lifespan, child mortality, their rising rates of college graduates, none of these, I am saying, suggest that Israel is a model liberal democracy. But those are nevertheless congruent with settler colonialism. These things are historical facts, and you see that in settler colonialism. Also, with time, Palestinian Arabs in Israel, they assumed a sense of Israeliness. This Israeliness, and I think it exists even today, this Israeliness is also an indication that between Israel and its Arab citizens, there's more of a settler colonial relationship than a colonial one. It's worth pointing out that if Israel is indeed a settler colonial state, then it is as legitimate or illegitimate as some of the other states that are home to its fiercest critics. While anti-Israel activists in this country probably support the USA, the policies, state and federal government policies of political reconciliation and compensation with their respective, with the various Indian nations in this country. But these steps ultimately amount to assimilating indigenous peoples in a multicultural tapestry under the settler state. Things like land acknowledgements are settler colonialism at its highest form, not its negation. And yet, even if you think these gestures are empty, or you think that they are important, and many people of indigenous descent think they're important, okay? We still need to ask ourselves, I'll take a breather.
It makes it pleasant felt.
It might come down completely.
This is dramatic. Listen to me.
Entirely closed in. Okay.
So whatever you think about land acknowledgements, if you, I'm not telling you, I haven't formed a concrete opinion. We still need to ask why Zionists and Palestinians never entered this reconciliatory phase. Okay, what happened? Like it or not, a land acknowledgement is better than genocide, right? So why didn't we get there? It's 1967. It's the colonial turn in 1967. The following is a quick survey of Israeli-Palestinian conflict using this definition of settler colonialism as distinct from colonialism. And I think this helps us to explain, without casting Zionists with any essential traits, why did they did not go the same way as the US, Canada, and Australia went. And why did they never accommodate the remaining indigenous people within the settler society? And this explanation involves returning to 1967 as a turning point in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Following the June 1967 war, Israel suddenly controlled a larger territory with a much larger Palestinian population. During the first post-war election cycle, Israeli voters could choose between two programs. Not many people know this, but the right, under Begin, called for the annexation and building of settlements on the newly acquired occupied territories. But he also called for providing the Palestinian population with a viable path to Israeli citizenship. The Labor Party also advocated for settlements, but did not push for formal annexation and rejected a pathway for Palestinian citizenship. The Israeli public gave Labor 56 seats, and in the Knesset, over Begin's 26 seats. 56 to 26. By keeping the territories, not granting citizenship to its inhabitants, and implanting privileged Jewish Israeli settlers, the Israeli occupation began to resemble past cases of imperial control over colonial dependencies. It's a regime that's premised on ethnic supremacy and labor exploitation. If you were in Israel in the 80s, all you could see is Palestinian day workers building up Israel. Labor exploitation of subalterns. It's a more colonial regime than a settler colonial one. Demographically, the growth of the Palestinian population in the territories and its increased hostility towards Israel, that's the opposite of elimination. You have more native people and they hate you even more. Why would you want that if you're a settler colonist? That also suggests that we have in our hands after 67 a more colonial regime than a settler colonial one. Both pre and post 1967 Israeli governments encourage Judaization, Yehud, of the land via Jewish settlements. However, the kibbutzniks who settled on Palestinian lands in the 1950s were committed, at least in principle, to ending the military government and honoring the promise of Israeli citizenship for Arabs. In contrast, the settlers in the occupied territories have never been particularly troubled by the inferior political status of their Palestinian neighbors. Thus, we can say that the post-1967 Zionist settlers are more like the Algerian Pied Noir than they are like the European populations of Australia and America. They are more colonial settlers than they are settler colonials. In 1987, 20 years into Israel's colonial-like control of the territories, a popular anti-colonial uprising in the form of the First Intifada breaks. And, like other anti-colonial mutinies, it lowered the profitability of the colonial project. If there was ever an incentive for Zionists to continue with the colonial relationship with the Palestinians and territories, the Palestinians in the territories made Zionists think again. It's not worth it. Get out. The Oslo process, which came at the heels of the First Intifada, was an Israeli attempt to get Zionism back on a more settler colonial trajectory and abandon the colonial relationship with the Palestinians. One of the explicit motivations of the Zionist left for going forward with the Oslo process, it evinced a logic of native elimination. Not through ethnic cleansing, not through assimilation, but via redrawing the borders in a way that would have placed the Palestinian outside of Israeli control and responsibility. Oslo's collapse in the year 2000 meant the resurgence of colonial domination. This time, with harsher levels of Israeli oppression, more settlement, and more brutal militant resistance by the Palestinians. In 2005, Israel evacuated the Gaza Strip, but retained substantive control over it. While in the West Bank, it managed to subdue Palestinian resistance, continue the settlement project, all of this with the aid of the Palestinian Authority, which acted like a comprador class in a classic colonial case. For 2 decades, Israel successfully kept the Palestinians in a colonial matrix in the West Bank and Gaza Strips, while keeping resistance to manageable levels. Nothing lasts forever. The 10/7 Hamas massacre of Israeli towns and villages surrounding the Gaza Strip, its scale and tactics, they suggest a wish to erase all Zionist trace in Palestine. And if that was the objective, to erase all Zionists, then I think it failed. But the defeat, the Israeli defeat in those first few days, and the international dynamic that was created after the attack. How's the hunger strike? The Brown students going? It's over? Did Brown divest? Okay, so the defeat of the internet and was created after the attack. It may lead, what's going on right now, the things that people do on campus, whether I agree with the slogans, whether I agree, they could lead to a dynamic that will make Israelis choose to abandon the colonial patterns of interaction with the Palestinians. However, an Oslo-like settler colonial vision now faces stiff competition from another settler colonial vision, one of Palestinian ethnic cleansing and even genocide from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Daily statements made by top Israeli officials and non-officials and the scale of death of the destruction point in that direction. Let's hope and do all we can that Israel does not go down this particular settler colonial path. And now one final note on the advantages of employing settler colonialism in a Zionist paradigm. A paradigm in Zionist, the study of Zionism. If you think about it, and to be honest, Lorenzo Veracini thought about it and wrote it. There's another way to conceptualize the difference between colonialism and settler colonialism. Scholars like Fanon, Memmi, Chatterjee, Said all understood that the colonizer and colonized constitute each other and they're locked in a Manichaean relationship. All that settler colonialism analysis really requires us is to be aware is that settler colonists are not a duo. They're a triangle of constitutive relationships. One relationship is where the settlers came from, with where they came from forces on the outside. The second is a relationship with the people they encounter. The settlers of the 13 colonies were shaped by their relationship between the Native Americans and the European empires. Britain, but also France, who delved into continental politics. The settlers on the Oregon Trail were shaped by their relationship between the tribes they encountered in the West and the relationship with the federal government. The Zionists were constituted through balancing a relationship with anti-Semitic Europe and with the people they encountered in their Middle East destination. So, settler colonialism offers the most critical analysis of Zionism, not because it morally condemns it, but because it negates what is a central article of faith for almost all Zionists. Zionism, according to its adherents, is the natural outgrowth of a millennia-long distinct Jewish identity which combined a sense of ethnicity and religious practices that's shared among all Jews. Some Zionists may accede to the fact that this movement has been shaped by modern European anti-Semitism at the dawn of the nations. But they would scarcely admit, Zionists would scarcely admit, that the Palestinians, through their existence and resistance, also made them into who they are. Employing a settler colonialism analysis prevents the elimination of the Palestinians as agents in shaping Zionism to its core. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Arnon.